Not every unexplained event begins with something visible. Sometimes, it starts with a sound, a pattern, a detail that repeats often enough to be noticed, but not clearly enough to be understood. Across parts of the United Kingdom, there have been moments where something unusual was reported, not just once, but repeatedly. Lights appearing in the sky without a clear source, sounds that couldn't be traced back to anything familiar, and locations that became linked to accounts difficult to dismiss. What makes these cases different is not just the events themselves. It's the way they were observed. In some instances, multiple witnesses described similar details. In others, the reports came from areas connected to monitoring or controlled environments, places where unusual activity would likely be noticed. And yet, even with attention and documentation, the full explanation never seemed to settle. There are places history tried to forget, and stories that were never meant to be told. But the deeper you look, the harder they are to ignore. This is Behind Truths. The sounds that came from nowhere and were heard across an entire town. In the mid-1960s, residents of the town of Warminster began reporting something unusual. It didn't start with lights, it started with sound. People described hearing intense, low-frequency noises, vibrations that seemed to come from above rather than from the ground. Some compared it to a deep humming. Others said it felt more like a pressure than a sound, something that could be felt through walls and floors. At first, it was dismissed, isolated reports, easily explained as environmental noise or distant activity. But then it continued. More people came forward, describing similar experiences, often at night, when the town was otherwise quiet. In some cases, the sounds were strong enough to wake residents. In others, they were accompanied by a sensation of movement, as though something had passed overhead. As the reports increased, so did attention. The phenomenon became known locally as the Warminster thing, not because it was understood, but because no one could clearly define what it was. Then, the reports began to change. Alongside the sounds, some residents started to describe lights in the sky, bright objects seen at a distance, moving in ways that didn't resemble conventional aircraft. Some accounts suggested sudden changes in direction. Others focused on how quickly the lights appeared and disappeared. This shift brought a different level of interest. Visitors began traveling to Warminster, hoping to witness the phenomenon for themselves. The town, once quiet, became a point of attention for those curious about what was happening. Investigations followed. Possible explanations were considered: aircraft activity, atmospheric conditions, even experimental technology. Each offered partial answers, but none fully accounted for both the sounds and the visual reports. Because while some details could be explained individually, the combination of them remained unclear. Over time, the frequency of reports declined. The sounds became less common, the sightings less frequent, but they didn't disappear entirely, and the question remained: what could produce a phenomenon that was heard, felt, and in some cases seen, across an entire town? And if something like that could happen in an open environment, affecting so many people at once, the next case becomes even harder to ignore, because this time, it wasn't a single town. It was a location where sightings have been reported again and again, over years, not weeks. The town where sightings became routine, and no single explanation ever fit. In central Scotland, the small town of Bonnybridge became known for something few places experience at that scale: repeated sightings, unlike isolated incidents that fade over time. Reports in Bonnybridge continued, not just 4 months, but across years. It began with individual accounts, people noticing lights in the sky that didn't match the movement or behavior of conventional aircraft. Objects described as hovering, changing direction abruptly, or moving in complete silence. At first, these reports were treated as separate events, difficult to verify, easy to dismiss. But then the volume increased. More witnesses came forward, often describing similar details without any clear connection to each other. The sightings weren't limited to a single location either. They were reported across different areas in and around the town. Some accounts were brief, a light seen at a distance, moving in a way that felt unusual. Others were more detailed, descriptions of structured shapes, objects maintaining position in the sky before accelerating out of view, moments where the movement didn't follow patterns typically associated with known aircraft. As the reports continued, attention grew. Bonnybridge began to be recognized as one of the areas in the UK with the highest number of UFO-related sightings. Investigators, researchers, and curious visitors all took interest. Naturally, explanations were considered: misidentified aircraft, satellites, atmospheric effects, even drones in later years. Each possibility could account for some of the reports, but not all, because while individual sightings might be explained in isolation, the consistency across time, location, and witnesses made the overall pattern harder to dismiss entirely. Why would so many similar descriptions emerge from the same area? Why would sightings continue rather than fade? And why did many of them share details that didn't fully align with common explanations? There was no single answer, no defining event that resolved the pattern. Instead, Bonnybridge became something else, a location where sightings weren't just reported, they were expected. And if repeated observations in one area can remain unexplained, the next case moves closer to something even more structured. Because this time, the reports didn't come from a small town. They came from an area directly connected to military activity, where any unusual presence in the sky would be far more difficult to ignore. The night something was reported near a military base, and the details never fully aligned. In late December 1980, a series of events unfolded near Rendlesham Forest, an area located between two former US Air Force bases, RAF Bentwaters and RAF Woodbridge. What began as a routine night quickly turned into something else. Personnel stationed at the base reported seeing lights descending into the forest. At first, it was assumed to be a downed aircraft, a possibility that required immediate attention. A small team was sent to investigate. As they entered the forest, the reports became more specific. Lights were seen moving between the trees. In some accounts, they appeared to change color. In others, they were described as maintaining a fixed position before suddenly shifting direction. What stood out wasn't just the presence of the lights, it was how they behaved. According to witness accounts, the movement didn't resemble conventional aircraft. There were no clear signs of impact, no debris, and no immediate indication of what had been seen from a distance. Over the following nights, additional observations were reported. Some personnel described seeing a bright object at a distance, emitting light that appeared to pass through the trees. Others focused on the way it moved, controlled, but not easily comparable to known aerial activity. These reports were documented. A memo was later produced, summarizing the events as they were described at the time. It did not offer a definitive explanation, but confirmed that something unusual had been observed and investigated. Naturally, explanations were considered. A lighthouse in the distance was suggested as a possible source for some of the lights. Astronomical objects were also proposed, along with misinterpretations influenced by environmental conditions. Each explanation addressed certain elements, but not all of them, because while some aspects could be aligned with known sources, other details remained difficult to reconcile with a single cause. The presence of trained personnel, the consistency of certain descriptions, and the fact that the event was taken seriously enough to be formally recorded. Over time, the Rendlesham Forest incident became one of the most discussed cases of its kind in the UK, not because a conclusion was reached, but because one never fully settled. What was seen that night? Was it a combination of identifiable factors, interpreted under unusual conditions, or something that, even when observed and documented, didn't fit into a clear category? The answers remain uncertain. And if something like that could occur near a monitored military area, the final case moves even closer to something more controlled, because this time the focus isn't just on what was seen, it's on a location connected to operations where information itself may not always be fully visible. The location linked to investigations where some details were never fully public. In Wiltshire, not far from other well-known military and research sites, lies Rudllo Manor, a location that, at first glance, appears unremarkable. A building set within a controlled area, quiet, isolated, official, but over time, its name began to appear in a different context, not as a place where something was seen, but as a place where certain things may have been examined. Rudllo Manor has been associated with defence operations and administrative activity linked to the Royal Air Force. Historically, it has been connected to communications, intelligence, and, at various points, units responsible for monitoring unusual aerial reports. These connections are documented, but alongside them, another layer developed, one shaped less by confirmed information and more by suggestion. Accounts began to circulate that the location, or areas connected to it, may have been involved in handling reports that didn't fit standard explanations. Some descriptions extended further, suggesting the presence of underground sections or restricted facilities not openly detailed. It's important to note, there is no publicly confirmed evidence supporting those specific claims, but the association itself was enough to keep the location in discussion, because when a site is linked, even indirectly, to monitoring and analysis, it naturally becomes part of the broader question. What happens to reports that don't lead to clear conclusions? Are they simply recorded and set aside, or examined in ways that aren't always visible from the outside? Unlike the previous cases, Rudllo Manor is not defined by a single event. There are no widely agreed upon sightings tied directly to it. No specific moment that can be isolated and analysed. Instead, it represents something different, a point in the background, a place connected to the process rather than the occurrence. And that, in some ways, makes it more difficult to interpret, because while events can be questioned, compared, and revisited, processes are not always as visible. Rudllo Manor remains a real location, with a real role in past operations, but how much of that role is fully understood, and how much remains unclear, is a question that has never been fully answered. Across this video, we've explored 4 cases connected to the United Kingdom, each one involving events that were seen, heard, or reported, but never fully explained. A town where unexplained sounds were heard across entire neighbourhoods. A location where sightings became so frequent they were no longer unusual. An incident near a military base that was documented, but never fully resolved. And a site associated not with a single event, but with the possibility of how such events are handled. Now I want to hear from you. Which of these cases do you think has the most reasonable explanation, and which one still feels unresolved? And when multiple reports emerge, across different locations and different people, do you think they are simply coincidence, or part of something that hasn't been fully understood yet? Let me know in the comments, because sometimes the most difficult questions aren't about what was seen, but about what happens after it is reported.